500 soldiers don't abandon a fort without reason. They run from fear, from shame, or because they discovered something that should never have existed. And Captain Samuel Hayes was about to find out which one it was. If you're ready for a tale that'll shake you to your core, hit that subscribe button and let's dive into the most haunting mystery of the Old West. The year was 1878, and Fort Apache stood like a lone gravestone against the crimson Arizona sunset. Built on sacred Apache ground, the fortress had been the Army's iron fist in a land that refused to be conquered. For 3 years, 500 battle-hardened soldiers had called it home, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the blood-red mesa that surrounded them like ancient sentinels watching over forbidden secrets. Captain Samuel Hayes rode through the fort's gates expecting to find a military installation buzzing with activity. Instead, he found something that would haunt him forever: absolute silence. His horse's hooves echoed against empty wooden walkways while dust devils danced through abandoned barracks. The American flag still flew at full mast, but beneath it lay a mystery that would challenge everything he believed about honor, duty, and the price of blind obedience. What Hayes didn't know as he dismounted in that eerily quiet courtyard was that Fort Apache hadn't been abandoned by choice. The 500 men who once stood guard here had fled into the desert night, leaving behind their weapons, their honor, and a secret so dark that it would soon force Hayes to choose between his military oath and his soul. And somewhere in the shadows of the empty fort, a pair of young eyes watched his every move, eyes that held the key to understanding why America's finest soldiers had become deserters in a single, terrifying night. Hayes spent his first hour exploring the abandoned buildings, his footsteps the only sound in a place that should have been alive with military precision. The mess hall still had plates of food on the tables, hardened and covered in dust, as if the men had simply vanished mid-meal. In the armory, rifles stood in perfect formation, untouched and fully loaded. No soldier worth his salt leaves behind his weapon, yet here were enough firearms to supply a small army, all gathering dust like museum pieces in a tomb. The captain's quarters held the first real clue, a journal belonging to Colonel Marcus Webb, the fort's former commander. The final entry was dated just 5 days ago, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic with each line. The girl knows too much. The men are talking. God forgive us for what we've done. They're coming for us tonight. Hayes read the words 3 times, but they made no sense. What girl? Who was coming? And what had they done that was so terrible it could scatter 500 trained soldiers like leaves in a desert wind? As Hayes closed the journal, a sound made him freeze, the soft padding of bare feet across wooden planks. He drew his Colt .45 and moved toward the window, where he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A small figure darted between the buildings, quick as a shadow, with long black hair flowing behind her. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but she moved through the abandoned fort like she owned it, like she knew secrets that grown men had died to keep hidden. But what Hayes saw next would change everything about this mystery. The girl stopped at the fort's well and looked directly at Hayes' window, as if she'd known he was there all along. Her eyes were dark as midnight and held a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. She wore a simple white dress that had once been clean but now bore the dust and tears of someone who'd been living rough for days. Around her neck hung a distinctive silver cross that caught the dying sunlight like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Hayes holstered his weapon and walked outside, his hands visible and his movements slow. The girl didn't run. Instead, she spoke in perfect English, her voice clear and strong despite her obvious exhaustion. "You're the new captain. They told me you'd come." Her words hit Hayes like a physical blow. Who had told her? And how long had she been living alone in this ghost town of a fort? "What's your name, child?" Hayes asked, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "And what happened to the soldiers?" The girl studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Maria Santos. My father was Sergeant Rodriguez. And the soldiers didn't abandon this fort, Captain. They ran from it, because they learned that some orders are too evil to follow." The weight of her words settled over Hayes like a shroud. But what she told him next would reveal a truth so horrific that he'd understand why 500 men had chosen desertion over duty. Maria led Hayes to a hidden cellar beneath the commander's quarters, a place that wasn't on any official fort blueprints. The wooden stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into darkness, the air growing thick with the smell of fear and shame. In the flickering light of Hayes' oil lamp, the truth began to emerge like a nightmare rising from the depths of hell itself. The cellar was filled with Apache artifacts, sacred headdresses, ceremonial weapons, and tribal jewelry that should have been buried with the dead. But these weren't museum pieces or spoils of war. They were evidence of something far more sinister. Colonel Webb ordered raids on Apache burial grounds, Maria whispered, her young voice trembling with remembered horror. He told the men it was military intelligence, that they needed to understand Apache customs to fight them better. The deeper they went into the cellar, the worse it became. Hayes found wooden crates filled with bones, sacred medicine bags torn open and desecrated, and worst of all, a collection of photographs documenting the systematic destruction of Apache sacred sites. These weren't the actions of soldiers following orders. This was deliberate desecration, a violation of everything sacred to the Apache people. Maria's father had been the post photographer, forced to document Webb's war crimes for the colonel's twisted sense of superiority. The Apache medicine man came to the fort 3 days ago, Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't come for war. He came to tell Colonel Webb that the spirits of the defiled dead would have their revenge. That's when the soldiers started seeing things in the night. Shadows moving where no shadows should be. Voices calling from empty rooms. By sunrise, most of the garrison had fled into the desert, too terrified to stay but too ashamed to report what they'd been part of. But the real horror was still waiting to be discovered. Hayes studied the young girl in the lamplight, noticing details he'd missed before. The calluses on her hands from hard work, the way she carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd seen too much, and most importantly, the silver cross around her neck that bore an inscription he couldn't quite make out. Your father was Sergeant Rodriguez, Hayes said carefully. Where is he now? Maria's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her dust-stained cheeks. Papa tried to stop Colonel Webb. When he saw what the desecration was doing to the Apache families, how children were crying over empty graves where their grandparents should have rested, he refused to take any more photographs. He said some orders were too evil for any Christian man to follow. The lamp flickered as Maria continued her story, casting dancing shadows on the cellar walls like the ghosts of the Apache dead seeking justice. Colonel Webb called my father a traitor and a coward. He said Papa would face court-martial for disobeying direct orders. But that night, before they could arrest him, Papa came to our quarters and told me to hide. He said he was going to make this right, even if it cost him everything. Maria pulled the silver cross from around her neck and handed it to Hayes. In the lamplight, he could read the inscription, "To my beloved Maria, may you always choose courage over comfort. Papa." It was a father's final gift to his daughter, given on the night he decided to risk everything to stop a war crime. But what Sergeant Rodriguez had done to make things right would soon put his daughter in mortal danger. Papa went to the Apache camp that night, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger as she told her father's story. He carried a white flag and a wooden box containing photographs of every desecrated burial site. He knelt before Chief Cochise's son and confessed everything: the raids, the stolen artifacts, the photographs Webb had forced him to take. He begged for forgiveness and asked what he could do to make things right. Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cellar. Sergeant Rodriguez had done something almost unheard of. A U.S. soldier had crossed enemy lines alone to confess war crimes to the very people his army had wronged. It was either the bravest act Hayes had ever heard of, or the most foolish. Perhaps both. The Apache Council listened to Papa all night, Maria said, pride evident in her voice despite her tears. They could have killed him, could have tortured him for what the soldiers had done to their ancestors' remains. Instead, they gave him a choice: help them recover the stolen artifacts and sacred remains, or watch as they brought 1,000 warriors down on Fort Apache to take them back by force. Rodriguez had chosen to help, but his decision came with a terrible price. Webb discovered the sergeant's betrayal and declared him a deserter and a traitor. The colonel gave the garrison an ultimatum: help hunt down Rodriguez and bring him back for execution, or be charged as accomplices to treason. That's when the supernatural events began. Apache medicine men have ways of calling on the spirits of the wrong dead, and those spirits had been growing restless in their violated graves. But what happened next would tear the fort apart from the inside. The first soldier saw his dead brother walking the fort's walls at midnight, Maria whispered, her eyes wide with remembered terror. Private Johnson swore his brother called his name, even though he'd been killed at Little Bighorn 2 years ago. By morning, Johnson had packed his gear and ridden out, too scared to stay but too ashamed to explain why he was leaving. The supernatural occurrences escalated quickly after that. Soldiers reported hearing Apache chanting from empty buildings, seeing ghostly figures in traditional dress walking through walls, and finding their bunks filled with desert sand and grave dirt each morning. The fort's chapel bells rang at 3 a.m. every night, even though no living person was pulling the ropes. Most unsettling of all, every man who'd participated in the grave desecrations began having the same nightmare: Apache warriors standing at the foot of their beds, holding the bones of their ancestors and asking why white men disturbed the sleep of the dead. Colonel Webb tried to maintain order through military discipline, but fear was stronger than duty. When Sergeant Rodriguez was found dead in the desert, apparently killed by Apache arrows, the remaining soldiers faced a terrible truth. They were trapped between a vengeful colonel who demanded blind obedience and Apache spirits seeking justice for the crimes committed against their people. "Papa didn't die fighting," Maria said quietly. "He died protecting me." When Colonel Webb realized Papa had hidden me somewhere in the fort, he ordered a search. Papa led the soldiers away from where I was hiding, into the desert where the Apache were waiting. They gave him an honorable death because he'd tried to make things right. The girl's courage in the face of such loss reminded Hayes why he'd become a soldier in the first place. But the worst part of the story was yet to come. The breaking point came 3 days ago, when Colonel Webb made a decision that would haunt every man who served under him. Desperate to end the supernatural terror plaguing his command, Webb ordered his soldiers to burn everything in the cellar, including the sacred Apache remains. He declared that destroying the evidence would end the haunting and allow them to report Fort Apache as a successful pacification of hostile territory. But when the soldiers tried to carry out the order, something stopped them dead in their tracks. Every man who touched the sacred artifacts was struck by a vision. They saw themselves through Apache eyes, understood the pain of mothers weeping over empty graves, felt the anguish of children who could no longer visit their grandparents' resting places. The weight of what they'd done crushed their military training and left them facing a choice between duty and conscience. That night, the fort filled with voices, Maria remembered, her small body trembling with the memory. Not angry voices, but sad ones. Apache ancestors calling for their bones to come home, asking why the white soldiers had scattered their remains like trash. Even Colonel Webb heard them, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked afraid. By dawn, 500 soldiers had made their choice. They couldn't undo what they'd done, but they could refuse to make it worse. One by one, platoon by platoon, they packed their personal belongings and rode out into the desert, choosing desertion over participating in Webb's final act of desecration. Only Webb himself remained, too proud to run and too stubborn to admit his crimes. But even he wouldn't stay long once he realized what the Apache spirits had planned for him. Hayes found Webb's body at sunrise the next morning, sitting upright in the fort's chapel with his hands folded in prayer. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, but the colonel's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Beside him lay his final report, written in the same erratic handwriting Hayes had seen in the journal. "I cannot escape what I have done. They are calling me home." Maria explained what she'd witnessed from her hiding place in the chapel's bell tower. Colonel Webb spent his last night trying to pray, but every time he knelt at the altar, Apache voices whispered from the shadows. They weren't threatening him or cursing him. They were inviting him to join the ancestors he'd disturbed, to find the peace that could only come through accepting responsibility for his actions. The colonel had died of fear, but not fear of punishment. He'd died from the weight of understanding exactly what his desecration had cost the Apache people, and the terrible realization that no military medal or commendation could balance the scales of justice. His heart simply stopped when faced with the full magnitude of his sins against the dead. Papa used to say that the Apache believe death is just another journey, Maria said, looking toward the chapel where Webb's body still sat. Maybe the colonel finally understood that some journeys can't be avoided, only delayed. Hayes felt a chill as he realized that Webb's fate could easily become his own if he made the wrong choice. But first, he needed to understand exactly what choice he was facing. As if summoned by their conversation about the dead colonel, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert. Hayes climbed to the fort's highest watchtower and saw a sight that made his stomach drop. 200 Apache warriors riding in perfect formation toward Fort Apache, their faces painted for war, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. At their head rode a man Hayes recognized from wanted posters, Geronimo himself, the most feared Apache leader in the Southwest. Maria joined Hayes at the watchtower, showing no fear at the approaching war party. "They're not coming to fight," she said calmly. "They're coming to take their ancestors home." But Hayes could see the weapons, could read the grim determination in the warriors' faces. These were men who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point, who'd watched their sacred places violated and their people's remains scattered like refuse. The Apache formation stopped just outside rifle range and waited. Their message was clear. They wanted the return of their sacred artifacts and the bones of their ancestors, and they were prepared to take them by force if necessary. But they were also offering Hayes something no other cavalry officer in the territory had ever received, a chance to negotiate from a position of honor rather than fear. "Chief Cochise's son sent word through the reservation," Maria explained. "He knows you're here, Captain Hayes. He knows you weren't part of what Colonel Webb did. He's giving you one opportunity to do what's right, to return what was stolen and prevent a war that would cost hundreds of lives on both sides." Hayes realized he was facing the same choice that had driven 500 soldiers into the desert: follow military protocol that protected a dead colonel's reputation, or choose justice even if it meant ending his own career. Hayes descended from the watchtower knowing that the next hour would define not just his career, but his character. Military regulations were clear. Fort Apache was U.S. territory, and any artifacts within its boundaries were now property of the U.S. Army. Returning them to the Apache without proper authorization would be theft of government property and potentially treason. But keeping them would mean defending the actions of a dead war criminal and potentially starting a conflict that could spread across the entire Southwest. Maria watched Hayes pace the empty courtyard, understanding the weight of the decision he faced. "Papa told me once that there are two kinds of courage," she said quietly. "The courage to follow orders and the courage to break them when they're wrong." He said real soldiers know the difference. Through the fort's gates, Hayes could see Geronimo dismount and walk slowly toward the entrance, his hands empty but his bearing proud. The Apache leader was offering to negotiate, something that went against everything Hayes had been taught about savage warfare. Here was a man whose people had suffered unspeakable violations, yet he was still willing to talk before resorting to violence. Hayes made his decision. He walked to the cellar and began carrying the sacred artifacts up into the sunlight, his heart pounding with each step. He was violating direct orders, destroying his military career, and possibly facing court-martial and execution. But as he placed the first Apache medicine bundle in the courtyard dirt, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that he was doing the right thing. But would that certainty be enough when the army came looking for answers? Geronimo entered Fort Apache like a ghost walking through the ruins of his nightmares. Hayes stood in the courtyard surrounded by sacred Apache artifacts, his military career dying with each item he'd removed from Webb's hidden cellar. The two men faced each other across a divide deeper than culture or language. They were separated by history itself, by generations of violence and mistrust that had painted the Southwest red with blood from both sides. "You are not like the dead colonel," Geronimo said in careful English, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You could have hidden what he did, blamed the Apache for attacking an innocent fort. Your army would have believed you, would have sent more soldiers to punish us for crimes we did not commit." The Apache leader gestured toward the artifacts scattered in the courtyard dirt. "Instead, you choose truth over safety. This takes a different kind of courage." But Hayes' moment of moral clarity was shattered by the sound of approaching cavalry. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of a full regiment, sent to investigate reports of Fort Apache's abandonment. Leading them was General Morrison, Webb's superior officer and a man known for his absolute intolerance of insubordination. Hayes realized with growing horror that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. He was standing in the middle of stolen Apache artifacts, apparently negotiating with the most wanted man in the territory. The confrontation erupted when General Morrison rode through the fort's gates and saw Hayes standing beside Geronimo. "Captain Hayes, step away from that savage and explain yourself." But Hayes remained where he was, knowing that his next words would either prevent a massacre or guarantee one. Maria stepped forward and handed him her father's final letter, the one Rodriguez had written before sacrificing his life to stop Webb's war crimes. With that letter in his hands, Hayes found the courage to tell the truth that would either damn him or set everyone free. Hayes read Sergeant Rodriguez's letter aloud, every word a condemnation of Colonel Webb's actions and a testimony to one soldier's courage in the face of evil. The letter detailed Webb's orders, the systematic desecration of Apache burial grounds, and Rodriguez's decision to risk everything to make things right. As Hayes spoke, he watched General Morrison's face change from anger to shock to something that might have been shame. The artifacts were returned to their people in a ceremony that mixed Apache tradition with military honor. Maria sang a song her Apache mother had taught her, while Geronimo offered prayers for the souls of the disturbed dead. Hayes stood at attention throughout the ceremony, knowing he was witnessing something that would never appear in any official report but would be remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations. General Morrison faced a choice similar to the one that had confronted Hayes: protect the reputation of a dead colonel or acknowledge the truth about what had happened at Fort Apache. In the end, he chose a middle path. Webb's crimes would be buried in classified files, the fort would be officially abandoned due to strategic considerations, and Hayes would be quietly transferred to a desk job in Washington where his inconvenient conscience couldn't cause more problems. Hayes accepted his fate without complaint. He'd saved lives on both sides, prevented a war that could have consumed the entire territory, and helped restore sacred remains to their proper resting places. Maria was taken in by relatives on the Apache reservation, where she would grow up bilingual and bicultural, serving as a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other better. As Hayes rode away from Fort Apache for the last time, he looked back at the empty buildings and realized that 500 soldiers had ultimately made the right choice. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in following orders, but in knowing when those orders are too evil to obey. What choice would you make when duty conflicts with conscience? Comment below and subscribe for more untold stories of the Old West, where ordinary people faced extraordinary moral challenges that still echo today.